Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and ghouls and children of the night everywhere, and welcome back to the Ambassadorial Wing. And hope you all are having a lovely Wednesday evening. We are back live here on the Ambassador Wing, where we talk cinema, modern, retro, and ultra retro, where we talk streaming. If it's geeky, if it's nerdy, if it's fun, this is the place to be. And tonight we are continuing our ultra retro / retro review series, our Halloween festivities, and we're going to be asking a very interesting question. Which Dracula is better? And we will be focusing on two particular performances. One from the 1930s starring the late, the great Bela Lugosi, and one from the 1990s starring quite a personal favorite of mine, Mr. Gary Oldman. And of course, if this is your first visit to the Ambassador Wing, welcome one, welcome all. Hope you all enjoy the stream. Make sure you smash that like button. Make sure you sink your teeth into it. Share this out with all your fellow your children of the night, and tell them, get on over to the Ambassador Wing and join the fun. And tonight I have popped the link to the stream into the chat so that any of you ghouls or goblins or other children of the night want to join me for the discussion for the stream, the link is there. And I have also posted a poll as well, asking the question, which Dracula was better, Lugosi or Oldman? Or perhaps both. So, but with all that being said, we don't stand on a whole lot of ceremony. I don't do long intros, never have done long intros, never will do long intros. We're going to jump right into the discussion tonight. And I'm going to give you all my thoughts and everything to begin with, and just share some of my impressions on these two, I will say, outstanding pieces of cinema. Now, we're going to jump into the way back machine and also into the way, way back machine. And we're going to go back to the 1930s first. And we're going to be discussing Universal Studios, I think, quite honestly, a somewhat forgotten masterpiece. Carl Laemmle's Dracula. And, honestly, this, I think, is one of those movies that everybody watches around this time of year, around Halloween time. And it is quite literally one of the most quotable, one of the most influential, particularly one of the most influential films of its decade, and even nowadays, the original Dracula, the original black and white Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. It is, honestly, it is a outstanding film for the time, and even so, considering some of the special effects are, I will say, extremely dated. But there has always been something enrapturing, there's always been something captivating, there's been something enthralling about this particular adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. And the interesting thing is, this particular adaptation, starring Bela Lugosi, doesn't stick very close to the original source material. Now, I have done extensive research on this film, actually on both films, as a matter of fact. And I have to admit, I love this film. I absolutely, positively love this film, but compared to Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation, which came out in 1992, this one does lack. But where it lacks in terms of special effects, it makes up in spades in terms of performance, in terms of atmosphere, in terms of everything else across the board. This, for the longest time, has been the benchmark for what a good or even a great film can be. And I think, honestly, this is at times somewhat forgotten by cinephiles. And, looking back at all the work that was done on the original Dracula, obviously they didn't have the special effects budget. They didn't have the costuming budget and all the other things that the original Dracula had, or that other adaptations have had over the years. But when you look at Bela Lugosi's performance, and you look at the rest of the cast who worked with Bela Lugosi in this film, Helen Chandler, who plays Mina Harker, and you've got, let's see, hang on, I bring up the cast list now. So, come on, being a little slow this evening. Yeah, I mean, you've got Edward Van Sloan as Abraham Van Helsing. You have David Manners as John Harker. You have Dwight Fry, who, for those of you that are familiar with the Universal movie monsters, will remember he also made an appearance in the original Frankenstein starring Boris Karloff. And he played Fritz, which was Dr. Frankenstein's assistant. And this cast is, unfortunately, I think at times forgotten. I mean, obviously, Bela Lugosi's performance in this film kind of overshadows everybody else, except for maybe Edward Van Sloan, who played Van Helsing in this particular adaptation. But for me, growing up, this was the Dracula I grew up on. This was the Dracula a lot of us grew up on, honestly. And it left a very profound impression on myself, and I imagine a lot of other people as well. And that's one of the reasons why it has stood the test of time, why it still is as influential now as it was in 1931. And the funny thing you have to remember about at this particular point in history, the world, and particularly the United States, was a few years into the Great Depression. And amazingly, Universal was able to put out films like Dracula, like Frankenstein, like The Invisible Man, and so on, like The Wolfman even. And it is a real testament to just how passionate the people at Universal were about putting out movies, even in a time when the economics of making movies wasn't the best. And it's interesting because getting back into my own childhood, for those of you who know, my maternal grandmother helped raise me. And she was a child during the Great Depression. She was born in 1926, just a few years just a few years prior to the stock market crash of 1929. And I asked her in particular about the old black and white movies, because, well, she grew up watching them. I mean, especially as a young woman. And I asked her, did you ever see Dracula in theaters? And she's like, no, never had a chance to. She's like, we just, for a lot of people, going to the theater just wasn't feasible. But she's like, I did grow up watching this. And she's like, as I got older, we got to watch it on TV and so on. She's like, every Halloween, they would run Dracula, they'd run Frankenstein, all these. I asked her, I was like, well, did you like it? And she's like, yeah. She's like, compared to what you have now, she's like, we love this movie. We love these old movies, the old monster movies, the old Universal monster movies. But she had very interesting perspective on it. she's like, we watched these to kind of escape what was going on in our lives at the time. And because, as I said, my grandmother grew up during the Great Depression. She grew up going through World War II. And her husband, my grandfather, and everything served in World War II, but that's kind of beside the point. But this was something that Mother Ambassador also exposed me to. And I'm glad, honestly, that she did, because it gave me an appreciation not only for the cinema that her and her family and, well, my grandparents grew up on, but it gave me a deeper appreciation for the nuanced performances in this picture, because you didn't have a big special effects budget, not to mention you didn't have a whole lot of real fancy special effects like we do nowadays, or even going into the 1990s and the 1980s and so on. So it had to come down to the performances. It came down to the skill of these actors and actresses to convey the story to the audience. And that, honestly, for me, is one of the really cool things about these older pictures, like Frankenstein, like Dracula, and, a lot of these other pictures. I mean, when me and Zach, my friend Zach Leary, we did our review of The Fall of House of Usher last night, which unfortunately got taken down by the idiots of YouTube, or the idiotic algorithm of YouTube. But I will be working on that. So for those of you that did miss that stream, I will be putting out an edited version of it so that y'all can catch up on that. And honestly, reviewing these older films has given me a deeper appreciation for what we do have now. And, getting a little deeper into the discussion here, asking the question, which performance was better? Was it Bela Lugosi or was it Gary Oldman? It comes down to several different factors. And the first one is, which is more accurate to the novel? Now, I've read and I've watched several critiques and summaries on the original novel penned by Bram Stoker. And I have to say that Francis Ford Coppola's film of Dracula does stick closer to the original source material. And I will admit, I do enjoy the performances in that film. I mean, you've got Gary Oldman, you've got Anthony Hopkins, you've got Winona Ryder, you've got Keanu Reeves, and the list just goes on in terms of the cast for Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. And it's, as accurate to the book that Francis Ford Coppola sticks, and that is to be applauded, because Dracula is a hard book to adapt, because it is what you would call a slow burn. It's told through diary entries and personal correspondence between the various characters. It's told from almost a POV perspective, dependent upon the different characters that are adding their own perspective to this story. It's not told in a traditional sense or anything, or told in a traditional format for a book. What Bram Stoker did with this novel in telling this story was actually rather unique. And that has at times made it difficult to adapt into a motion picture. But the interesting thing is, considering the differences in how these films are structured in terms of the 1931 Dracula and the 1992 Dracula, while Coppola's film does capture the essence of the novel better, and the novel and the performances, I would say, in particular with certain characters, are more nuanced and there's more depth to them. And also considering that, well, let me pull this up real quick because I believe that the 1931 film. Let's see. Let me go back one spot here. So, hang on one second, guys. All right, hang on. Right now, I'm not interested in Wakanda Forever, the outcome later. All right, I'll look it up in a minute. Here we go. Okay, 1992. Here we go. Two 2 hours and 8 minutes. Okay, and how long is the Lugosi, the Todd Browning one? An hour and 15 minutes. Okay, so we've got a full. We've got almost an hour difference between the two films. And I will say this much. How they structured Dracula in 1931, it does present a compelling story. It does present the concept of the story from the original novel rather well. It's not as accurate to the book, but it does give room for the story to develop, although in a much truncated or shorter time span. And you don't have as much interaction between Dracula and in this particular instance with oh, for heaven's sakes, brain fart. I hate when these happen. Let's see. Okay, hang on here. Renfield. In the 1931 version, it's Renfield that we see first go to Transylvania to meet with Count Dracula. In the 1992 version, it's Jonathan Harker who goes as a follow-up to Renfield's visit to see Count Dracula. And that's one of the first differences between the two. Now, if I recall correctly, in the original novel, Renfield has already returned from Transylvania, and he has gone mad. What we see in the 1931 version is Renfield has gone to, or is going to Transylvania to meet with Count Dracula. Jonathan Harker is almost a side character in the 1931 version, whereas in the 1992 version, he is a main character, at least for a good 20 or 30 minutes in the movie, and then he drops out. The interesting thing here with these two films is they are structured very differently. And what Coppola, in terms of his adaptation, is he does stick to the story. He does stick to how the book is structured. He has voiceovers, he has narration in his story, which would be more accurate to the novel. You don't have that in the 1931 version. Again, it could simply be because at the time, voiceover technology wasn't as clear or as crisp as it was in the into the 80s and 90s and so on. Well, or even coming out of the black and white era and getting better audio technology going forward. Now, one thing that I found interesting many years ago, I think it was like in the early to mid 90s, they did a DVD re-release, but then this was when DVD was becoming a big thing or actually it was actually the late 90s going into the 2000s when DVD was becoming a big thing. They did a re-release of all the classic black and white Universal monster movies. But the thing that they did for Dracula, which I thought was actually a very nice touch, was they actually did a brand new score, because the original score, and I do remember this, for Dracula in 1931, was that the score was rather generic. But they brought in a string quartet called the Kronos Quartet to do a brand new updated score for Dracula 1931. And I will say this, the updated score for Dracula adds a lot more atmosphere and adds, I think, added, and this is a string quartet. It's a violin and cello and bass violin um quartet, and I thought that was a very, very wonderful touch and everything, considering the gothic nature of the story. The other interesting thing about Dracula 1931 is in comparison, you have Edward Van Sloan, who also made an appearance as Victor Frankenstein's professor in the Frankenstein. In this particular film, he plays Abraham Van Helsing, who is a doctor, a professor, a teacher, and also you could almost make the argument, an expert in the occult. And the 1992, and I will say this of Edward Van Sloan's performance, him and Bela Lugosi, the two of them acted superbly off of each other in this film. And Edward Van Sloan is one of those, I mean, he's one of those forgotten actors from the early black and white era. And he had such a presence and such a command of any space that he was in when he was on screen. And in the various encounters that him and Dracula have on screen, you can tell that they are testing each other's wills and wits to see who's the smarter, who's the sharper of the two. And there's one particular interaction. This is I actually included it in the thumbnail, when Dracula realizes that Van Helsing has figured out who he is and what he is, and obviously that Dracula is in fact a vampire. And Dracula and Lugosi, and I will not try to imitate Lugosi here. His performance and everything deserves better than what I could do. I'll be blunt. But he's like, "Come here." And it's all in his voice and his eyes and his body language and his hand movements. And Van Helsing resists him. And Dracula gets kind of this really kind of creepy, wry smile on his face. And he's like, "Your will is strong." And he tries again, and Van Helsing starts to move towards him. And you probably can figure out that Dracula intends to kill Van Helsing, or at least put him under his sway. But just as Van Helsing gets within hand's reach of Dracula, he gets his wits about him. He pulls out a small crucifix out of his pocket and drives Dracula away, because obviously, as everybody knows, one of the weaknesses to a vampire is the crucifix and everything. And it doesn't have necessarily be a crucifix that has Christ on it. It can just be a cross, essentially. But he drives Van Helsing drives Dracula away. Now, in the 1992 version, we get a much different performance, and we get it from, again, a personal favorite actor of mine. That is, of course, Anthony Hopkins. And Anthony Hopkins, he actually plays two roles in everything. He has a brief cameo role at the beginning of the film as a priest, as I think a Catholic priest, and he's in prosthetic makeup to make him look different. He's in a different costuming altogether, and so on. But we really meet Van Helsing when Dr. Seward calls for him after his Lucy Westenra and everything becomes ill, and Seward's at a loss. He's like, I don't know what's going on here. So he's like, I'm gonna call my mentor. I'm gonna call the guy that taught me everything about medicine. And we meet Abraham Van Helsing for the first time in the 92 Dracula. And Hopkins's performance was as night and day from Edward Van Sloan's performance was. This Van Helsing was a little more eccentric. He was, and this is not necessarily anything as a negative, but he was at times a lot more obscene. He was in how he spoke and some of the language that he used and so on. But it wasn't profane to the point of being vulgar. It was just he was trying to drive a point across. It was that sort of Eastern European mentality, because you have to remember a good chunk of this story takes place in Eastern Europe because that's where Transylvania is located. Now, the other interesting thing about the 92 Dracula is we actually get more of a backstory on who Dracula was, or at least this particular version of who Dracula was. And they do dig into the historical figure Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler. But they give a different take on this particular version of who Dracula is. And in this particular version, Dracula was a Christian knight who fought against the Turks, or, well, as we would know them nowadays, the Muslims, because this particular version of Dracula did take place during the Crusades. And I have to admit, this added layer, this added depth to Dracula did give him a bit of empathy. It made his character more empathetic compared to the version in 1931 where Dracula is just pure evil. What we learn in the 92 version of Dracula is that Dracula was actually betrothed or married to a very beautiful young woman. And during the course of his fighting in the Crusades, he obviously survives, but what ends up happening is his wife Elizabeth, well, as they pronounce it, Elizabeta, or as we would pronounce it, Elizabeth, is given false information that Dracula has been killed, and she ends up taking her life, which actually does stick to some of the historical the historical aspects of Dracula's history. There was a knight, as I said, named Vlad Tepes. I think everybody knows the whole story behind Vlad the Impaler well enough. I don't have to rehash it here. But what they did was they incorporated some of that real world history into this particular version of Dracula to make him more empathetic, because he ends up saying, I fought for God. I fought for God's church to protect the church and protect the people. And he's like, in the end, I lost my wife. I lost the woman that I love. And because she committed suicide, for those of you who know, in the Catholic Church and in most Christian, the broader Christian world, suicide is viewed as a sin. You do not get allowed into heaven for it, or if you do commit suicide. And so Dracula, being extremely distraught, he renounces God. He renounces his Christianity. He renounces his faith, and he declares war on God himself. And in the course of doing all of that, he becomes what we know as the classic Dracula. Now, in Dracula 92, when we meet Jonathan Harker, played by Keanu Reeves, and I will say this, would I have thought of Keanu Reeves as my first choice to play Jonathan Harker in this film? Not necessarily. But I will say this of Keanu Reeves' performance. I thought it was actually rather good. Was it as good as Dwight Fry as Renfield in the 1931 film? Well, the issue is you've got two different characters, so you can't necessarily compare them because they are two different characters. But I will, going back to Renfield, you've got Dwight Fry playing Renfield in 1931. I can't remember the name of the actor. I think it was Stephen Witt. Might have been the Dracula in. Let me get down here. Where are you, bud? Tom Waits was R.M. Renfield in the 92 version. I will say this. I thought Tom Waits' performance compared to Dwight Fry's, you do get a sense of that mania and that madness that he displays when he is at the Seward Asylum. But I will say this of Dwight Fry's performance. That scene when he's in the bowels of the ship after it makes harbor in England, and you see the police investigating the ship to see if there's anybody left alive, and you hear that very deranged and very creepy and very unsettling laugh. Let's see if I can still do it. Actually, you know what? I'll do one better. Give me a minute, guys. I should have pulled some of this stuff up. I'm sorry, guys. I really am. Let's see. Come on. Come on. Shouldn't get in trouble for a clip. Yeah, if I do, I'll edit it out later. Let's see. Dracula. Come on. 1931. Come on. There it is. Okay. Don't want you to play. All right. Hang on 1 second here. Share screen. Share audio. There we go. All right. This is a very short clip, but I want y'all to listen to this because this is a laugh that can set anyone's hair on end. Just saying. So, all right. Are we up? We're up. All right. Here we go. I'm gonna play it one more time because that is that is the laugh of a madman if I ever heard one. Anyway, all right. Now, the thing I will say about Tom Waits' performance, and oh my gosh, I didn't realize this. Tom Waits. Tom Waits was the professor from Professor Heller from Mystery Men. Oh my gosh. Wow. I didn't catch that until just now. I'll be darned. But the thing I will say, Dwight, that very unsettling, that very creepy laugh, and the rest of Dwight Fry's performance was honestly very good. But I think what we have with Tom Waits and his performance in Dracula 92, we get more of a idea of what exactly Dracula did to Renfield in his time and everything. Even though we don't ever see, except for maybe one or two scenes, we don't ever see Renfield and Dracula interact while in Transylvania. What Coppola did, and I thought this was actually a very smart move, is he moved Renfield back over to England, where he's already crazy. And we have Jonathan Harker, played by Keanu Reeves. And honestly, for me, say what you will about Keanu Reeves. Honestly, I think Keanu Reeves is an outstanding actor. He had a bit of a slump, but you know what? He got back in his groove, particularly with the John Wick films. Now, for those of you who probably saw this review that I did late last year, I thought his performance in The Matrix Resurrections, honestly, I think he was wasted. I think a lot of that cast was wasted in that film because it was completely unnecessary. But I will say this: anything for him early on in his career, I thought Keanu Reeves did a really good job of portraying Jonathan Harker in this film. Like I said, Jonathan Harker was more of a side character in Dracula 1931. In this movie, he's more of a central figure, particularly him and Mina Harker. And I know y'all may think I'm going to sound crazy for saying this. I thought that Winona Ryder did a really good job as Mina, Mina Harker, once her and Jonathan marry, in the later on in the film. But there's a very interesting scene between Jonathan and Mina and Abraham Van Helsing. It's after Jonathan gets back, or actually after they're married, after he escapes from Dracula's castle, and they are married at a convent in there in near Transylvania, and Van Helsing's kind of interrogating Jonathan because, and this is something that I'm actually kind of glad that that Coppola did with his version compared to the other. Now, granted, in 1931, there were very strict rules about any type of nudity or any type of sexuality in film. It just wasn't done, like, period at all. And now, while we do see Dracula's brides in the 1931 version, they get a much different adaptation in the 1992 version where they are much more sexualized, and you do see them partially nude and everything at various points in the film, and they do play more of a pivotal role in the film compared to the 1931 version, because we do see them feeding on Jonathan and everything at a couple of points in the film. And it's shortly after that Jonathan goes mad and Dracula leaves for England. Because Jonathan's actually, for those of you that aren't familiar with the story, Jonathan goes to Transylvania to finalize the sale of Carfax Abbey and several other properties that Dracula has purchased. Because this particular version of Dracula, I mean, this particular plot point stays true in both versions, where Dracula has come to England to expand his influence and expand his power and essentially take over London and take over England and turn everybody into a vampire. The same thing is somewhat true in the 1992 version, but he focuses his attention's more on Mina Harker, because the interesting thing is, oh, for Pete's sakes, I just said her name. Winona Ryder also does double duty in this film because she portrays Dracula's original, his wife Elizabetha, and she obviously portrays Mina Harker, and they both bear a very strong resemblance because obviously they're played by the same actress. And Dracula becomes fixated on Mina, and while he does feed on um being his best friend Lucy Westenra. And I will say this of comparing the two Lucys, between the 1931 version and 1992 version, I do like the Lucy in 1992 better, just a little bit better than I do the 1931 version. I don't remember the name of the actress, but thankfully I've got my tabs up here. And where are you, darling? Let's see. Sadie Frost. Oh, wow. I did not know this. Monica Bellucci plays one of Dracula's brides. Huh. I did not realize that. Hmm. Nuh-uh. No, he didn't. Are we talking about? Okay, nope. Not the same one. Okay, not the same Bill Campbell. For a minute there, I thought this movie... Oh, crap. Did not mean to do that. Close my dang tab. It's okay. Yeah, here we go. But of course, we come down to, the main character, obviously, and that is, of course, Dracula. And I'll go into some more of the particulars of both films and everything here shortly. But I want to get to the main topic of this evening. Which Dracula is better? Or is it maybe both? Bela Lugosi's performance in this film, in the Todd Browning version of Dracula, he brings a lot to it, and he has to. I mean, the interesting thing about Bela Lugosi, this was his first starring role. This is the role he was known almost primarily for, and it also was kind of unfortunate that he got typecast because of this role. But the question becomes, is it better to be typecast for a great performance, or is it regrettable that he was typecast for such a powerful performance in this film? I mean, obviously, Bela Lugosi went on to do numerous other parts throughout his career and so on. And he had his heyday, he had his time, and unfortunately, he kind of faded into obscurity. And again, that's, as I said before, that's unfortunate because considering his acting ability, Bela Lugosi could have done just about anything. I mean, he was, I think, at least he was that good of an actor. But Gary Oldman's performance, and this was also early on in Gary Oldman's career. Remember, this came out in 1992. Gary Oldman was just getting into acting, in a real big way, and I think the biggest difference is the fact that in Francis Ford Coppola's version, we get a sense that Dracula wasn't always evil. He was a man. He was mortal, and he felt cheated, he felt wronged, and he was going to go to war against God, against humanity, for what he felt was a slight. And again, that's unfortunate. But what Gary Oldman is able to bring to this performance is a lot of depth and a lot of nuance, in terms of the fact that we see Dracula at various phases and everything throughout this movie. We see him as the old, kind of sickly old man with that very outlandish hairdo and the hairy palms and the big red robe. And he's at times a bit charming, but at times as well he's a bit unsettling and everything. There's one particular um interaction between old Dracula and Jonathan Harker there at at Dracula's castle. And Jonathan makes kind of a just off the cuff mark, and Dracula goes into a rage, and he picks up a sword and he almost holds it to Jonathan's throat and says, "We Draculs have a reason to be proud," because Jonathan kind of made a unintentional um, joke about Dracula's pedigree, about his background, about his lineage. And there's another interaction a little while after that where Dracula is actually giving Jonathan a shave, and you see this very unsettling scene. It's so quick that you can almost miss it, where Dracula nicks Jonathan as he shaves him, and he takes the straight razor and he licks it, because that's how thirsty and hungry and starved for blood he is. But as I mentioned before, in the scene where Jonathan interacts with Dracula's brides for the first time, and Dracula calls them off of him, and he and Jonathan's laying there on the floor watching the four of them interact, and Dracula pulls out a baby and gives it to them to feed on, and it drives Jonathan mad. And you hear this very unsettling, almost as unsettling as uh, Dwight Frye's Renfield's laugh, but in this instance, it's Gary Oldman as Dracula, and he's relishing in the fact that he has driven Jonathan mad as well. Now, the difference in everything is we see Jonathan wandering wandering the castle both before and after Dracula leaves for England. And in one particular portion of this, we hear Jonathan say, "I am going to make one final attempt to escape from this damn castle." He's like, "Either I will survive or I will die in the attempt." But he's like, I have to get out of here and warn Mina about what's coming." And we transition from there to England. And by this point, Dracula has arrived in England, and he's fully rejuvenated because he's fed on enough people on the ship that he's regained his younger appearance. And I have to admit, the interactions between Mina and Dracula in this particular film, there's a lot more nuance, there's a lot more depth to them. She kind of finds him very bizarre and very strange because he is from Eastern Europe, and their customs and their behavior is rather foreign to people in England. But what Gary Oldman brings in his performance as Dracula is a air of empathy. because all Dracula ever wanted was to live his life with the woman that he loves. He did his duty for God, king, and country, quite literally. And as I mentioned before, he feels that he has been wronged. He has been wronged by God because of the Christian belief that a person who commits suicide is outside of the grace of God. Even though she, to our, I think to our modern interpretation, what Elizabetha did wasn't inherently a sin. Because she was tricked, she was fooled into believing that Dracula had been killed in combat. And that was a thought to her mind that she could not live with. Because the love that her and Dracula shared was so powerful and so intense that she's like, well, I don't wholly agree or entirely agree with her way of thinking. I can see why someone might feel that way. I mean, just dipping into my own personal my own personal background, my own personal history. After my father died, my mother did not feel that she could not go on living. I mean, obviously she had me, she had her brother, my uncle, and she had her family, she had her friends and everything, so she had a reason to go on. But in the terms of Elizabeth, and in the context of the story, putting aside my own, or not to say putting aside, but incorporating my own Christian beliefs, not saying that I am speaking for God or anything to that extent. Do I think maybe God would have had mercy on Elizabeth for committing suicide and did allow her into his kingdom, or at least allowed her into purgatory so that she could erase that sin? Yeah, maybe. We can't say definitively, obviously, this is a fictionalized story and we are dealing with a hypothetical situation. But if we do believe that the Almighty is merciful and we do believe the Almighty is understanding, then, yeah, perhaps Dracula acted hastily. But considering the time period in which the prologue of this film takes place, that would have not been taken into consideration by the church. So, in the eyes of the church and the church's leadership, Dracula's wife killing herself was a hell-worthy sin. And that's honestly unfortunate. Because if that had not happened, then Dracula would have never renounced God. But the fact that he did, it set in motion the events that we see in this film. But the question, coming down to the question, which Dracula is better? And there's a lot more to dig into here, and I will dig into this a little bit further. But coming to this particular question, which performance is better? Potentially, which film is better? Putting aside the restrictions in terms of special effects and budgetary reasons because of, as I mentioned before, the Great Depression. Did the production team at Universal Studios, did the people who were in charge of writing the story, of adapting the original novel by Bram Stoker, in regards to everyone that performed in the 1931 version compared to the 1992 version, is Dracula 1931 superior? Or in particular, is Bela Lugosi's performance superior to Gary Oldman's? I have to say no. But again, this is just my opinion. While Bela Lugosi does bring a lot to his performance, and he does, This is a different Dracula for a different time. This is Dracula that is the personification of evil. He is a plague. He is a blight upon humanity, upon the world, that corrupts and turns everything that he interacts with. But that's because it is his nature. We don't know anything further beyond Dracula than that he is evil incarnate. And that is that that's not a bad adaptation for this character. And because at the time in the 1930s, people wanted a cut and dry villain. And again, that's not a bad thing, because you have to look at the mentality of the audience of that time. They had just gotten out of the First World War. They were dealing with the Great Depression, and people wanted an escape. They wanted good versus evil, and that's what we got. That's what they got in the 1931 Dracula. They got good versus evil. In the 1992 version, the world is different. Different audience, different mentality. And what Francis Ford Coppola does with his adaptation of Dracula is he presents a different perspective. He presents a backstory which empathizes Dracula, and he casts a actor who he felt, and I think he did cast this movie properly, with Gary Oldman as Dracula. And we get a Dracula who isn't evil personified. He is a man who feels that he has been wronged by the Catholic Church, but further still has been wronged by God because of the belief that if you commit suicide, you go to hell for it. But not only that, there's still a piece of Dracula that is still human, that still does love. Granted, he loves another man's wife, but in his mind, he doesn't see Mina Harker. He sees Elizabetha, and he even calls her such numerous times throughout the course of this film. Now, the other interesting thing about this film is we get a um, inside look into Mina's life and her mindset. And we have it through various journal entries or diary entries by Mina, that she's kind of enraptured by her strange new friend, uh, Prince Vlad of Sangheil, as Dracula introduces himself the first time him and Mina meet on the streets of London. And she's like, this man is different in so many ways from all the other people that I have met in my time. And you see them um, go to dinner, you see them sit in a parlor and drink absinthe, which back in those days was a um, very hallucinogenic, very intoxicating alcoholic beverage. It's illegal now. Well, that particular version of it is illegal. They've actually, there are companies, distilleries that do still produce absinthe, but it doesn't have the hallucinogenic properties that it did back in the time that this version of Dracula took place. We see them go to a very early version of a movie theater. We see also Dracula tame, I can't remember if it's a wolf or a tiger, but I think it's a wolf. And he invites Mina to pet the wolf, and she does. And you see all these interactions between the two of them, and you see Mina, who is still under the impression that Jonathan is elsewhere, and they have not yet been um, engaged to be married yet, or they have not married yet. Let me put it that way. But when Jonathan sends word that or the convent where Jonathan is recovering sends word that he is alive, Mina leaves Dracula. And he becomes vengeful again. It's almost as if Mina tames the wilder aspects or the more vengeful aspect of Dracula's personality. And in turn, he somewhat, I think unintentionally, but maybe intentionally, seduces Mina. Not seduces in the sexual term of the meaning of the word, but more in terms of tries to draw her into her world, try to awaken what he might feel is the reincarnation of the woman that he was once in love with. And once Mina leaves to go join Jonathan elsewhere, that's when Dracula reverts back to his old form. And he goes after Lucy Westenra and starts feeding on her and eventually turns her into a vampire and everything, because he eventually kills her and everything. And we see her a couple of times in her vampiric form, and she has taken to feeding on young children. And she is at this point has married, and she married. And this is another interesting thing in terms of the cast for this film, because when I saw this for the first time, I was like, wait a minute, I recognize one of these actors. And you've got Richard E. Grant as Dr. Jack Seward. You've got Carrie Yules, which is the one I wanted to point out in particular, as Lord Arthur Homewood. And you have Billy Campbell as Quincy P. Morris, which some people have described as Bram Stoker's personification of the state of Texas. Because for those of you that have seen Dracula, or this particular version of Dracula, Quincy P. Morris is every inch of what a Irishman might consider to be the atypical Texan or the atypical American. And Carrie Yule's character, Arthur Homewood, Carrie Yule's everything he's in, he's awesome. Whether it's as in The Princess Bride or Twister or Robin Hood Men in Tights, Carrie Yule's is a win. I'm just gonna say it. But Lucy ends up marrying Carrie Yule's and marries Arthur Homewood, and it's rather interesting because it's at this point is when Abraham Van Helsing, played by Anthony Hopkins, enters the story. And you have Anthony Hopkins, who is honestly one of my all-time favorite actors. There is a list. And I think if I ever have the time, I'll sit down and record like my top all-time favorite actors. Well, I'll tell you right now, Anthony Hopkins is in the top 10. Maybe not top 5, but he's in the top 10. And his performances of Van Helsing is, as I mentioned before, rather eccentric. But also at the same time, he knows how Dracula functions. He knows how a vampire functions because, again, this particular version of Van Helsing, as I said before, you can make a very strong inference. Not only is he a medical doctor, but he has a lot of experience with the supernatural and potentially even the occult. And obviously, this is a man who's encountered vampires or vampirism in his past before. And when we see Van Helsing with Lucy's three suitors, and after the fact when it's just the two suitors and her husband. We see a very interesting dynamic because Van Helsing and the I hate to call them the three suitors, but that's what essentially they are. Um, they're the anti-Dracula team. And when they go into Lucy's tomb after Lucy has died and become a vampire, turned into a full-fledged vampire, they end up having to drive a stake through Lucy's heart and chopping off her head. And you actually see, I think it's Quincy Morris, who ends up chopping off Lucy's head with his big Bowie knife. And once Jonathan and Mina come back from Eastern Europe to London, and there's this very brief scene where Jonathan sees Dracula on the street, and Dracula is not his calm, cool, collected self. He's the feral animal at this point. That's something we don't see from Bela Lugosi's performance. Now, granted, as I mentioned before, the 1992 version of Dracula is somewhat longer by at least 45 minutes. And that 45 minutes, Coppola gives us a lot more story than what the 1931 version does. And personally, for me, coming back to the question, which Dracula is better? I'm going to have to admit, as much as I grew up on watching the original the original black and white Dracula, and I still love it to this day, I think what Francis Ford Coppola did with his adaptation wasn't necessarily better, but I think it is a lot more relatable. And I think, honestly, at least for myself, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, Gary Oldman's Dracula, is the superior of the two. Or at least the more in-depth of the two. Now, I do want to speak to some of the, the set design and so on of this film, in terms of the 1931 Dracula and the 1992. The set design for the 1931 version is rather simplistic. And that's, like I mentioned before, because of budgetary reasons. Universal Studios was working on a shoestring budget, just like everybody else was at that time in the world. The costuming was nothing spectacular. It was, I think, adequate. The special effects, well, let's be honest. A rubber bat on a stick on a string, yeah, kind of cheesy. Whereas you have that I think one of the coolest transformations ever put on screen, put on film, where Dracula transformed into his monstrous humanoid bat form after he's turned Mina, and the Van Helsing and the others back him into a darkened closet, and he transforms into a horde of rats. That to me was a really creep-inducing, but also really cool transformation. Not to mention the special effects makeup for Dracula, for Gary Oldman, and you see him go through a incredible transformation throughout this film, from old Dracula and everything with the big, like I said, the big outlandish hairdo that almost looks like a butt. Just saying, looks like a big white butt on his head, or well, a big white hairy butt on his head, to the younger version that we meet in London with the long black jet hair, the top hat, the walking stick, the really cool clip-on sunglasses or spectacles, as they would have been called back then, and in one of his more bestial form, um, and then of course at the very end where you have him transform from his vampiric form back into his human form. And, say what you will, the image of Mina on the floor next to Dracula after she's run a sword through his chest and then takes that same sword and chops his head off. An absolutely incredible piece of prosthetic work. It's tricky trying to do a beheading scene and make it look good. I think for the early 90s, they did a pretty damn good job and everything of showing both when Lucy was beheaded and when Mina beheads Dracula as well. And of course, obviously, Mina does recover from her vampirism because she gets turned into a vampire as well. But it's, these movies leave an impression on you. They certainly have me. And that's why I've spent the last hour, a little bit over an hour now, sharing my thoughts with you all. Because films and characters like Dracula do live on. I mean, he started out as a purely literary character. The concept of the vampire has evolved and changed over the decades and even the centuries. Because Bram Stoker's original novel was written, I believe, in the late 1800s, give or take. I'm going to look that up real quick. Give me 1 second, guys. I want to look this up. It was Dracula. Yep, 1897. 3 years before the turn of the century. So this story has been around for several hundred years now, or a couple of hundred years now. And, well, actually, let's see. 1897 to 1997 would have been 100 years. So a shade over, 100, to 2007 would be 110 years, 120 years. It's 2022 now. So 125 years, give or take, that the character of Dracula has existed and the concept of vampires has existed. But for some reason, it's these two films that a lot of people go back to. And I think justifiably so. Because they are Draculas for different decades, for different audiences. And whereas Bela Lugosi portrayed the Dracula who was pure evil, who has no redeeming qualities whatsoever, who is just evil and corruption personified, Francis Ford Coppola decided to give us a different take. And honestly, I think it was a really gutsy move to do this type of film. But of course, Francis Ford Coppola is nothing but if not a visionary. And honestly, I'm, after reviewing these films and particularly watching Dracula, I feel like I need to give this guy a little more time. So you might see some more reviews on some of Francis Ford Coppola's other films and everything in the coming months. So, but I think we are going to go ahead and wrap up for this evening. I do want to thank you all for those of you that watch this live or who will catch us on replay. I hope you do enjoy the replay. I hope you enjoy my thoughts on the film, and I will leave the poll up in the chat and anything. And feel free, as always, to leave your thoughts on the poll. Which Dracula was better, Lugosi, Oldman, or was it both? So, I do want to let you all know I will be back tomorrow evening, wrapping up the Halloween festivities with something a little more silly, a little more goofy, a little more fun. Not that this review wasn't fun; it was. I will be, of course, sharing my thoughts with you all on Dam's family films from also from the 1990s, starring Raul Julia, the late Raul Julia, Angelica Houston, and of course Christopher Lloyd. So, but anyways, folks, you all have a wonderful evening. I will see you all tomorrow. Of course, as always, happy Halloween. Boo. Stay ambassadorial. And until next time, this is the Ambassador, signing off.